So the Gemara now is going back to, it's continuing in the Mishnah, right? We're still on the first Mishnah in the Perek. So let me just remind you of a couple of things that the Mishnah said. All right, so in the Mishnah, we're up to this part. It says, "Ha'ochel kekotevet hagasa, kemoa ve'ukegarinata, v'hashotem elo lugmav chayav." So the way we understood this, the plain way to understand the Mishnah is that if one eats the size of a fat date, kamoa, like the date, and its stone and its pit, and somebody who drinks a cheekful is chayav. So these are the shiurim for eating and drinking for which one is chayav a korban chatat if they did b'shogeg. And now the Mishnah is going to introduce some interesting twists on this. So the Gemara says, second. Okay. Okay. Haochel kekotevet hagasa. By Rav Papa. So Rav Papa asked this question. Kekotevet shamru begarinata o below garinata. The kotevet that they said, in other words, the kotevet that's in the Mishnah, is it with its pit or is it without its pit? So before we go on, what do we find strange about Rav Papa's question?
It already said in the Mishnah that it's with pit.
Right. The Mishnah itself said, Kamo ukagarinata. So it raises a question for us about Rav Papa's question. So we'll see how Rashi explains that in a moment. Let's read on a little bit. By Ravashi. Ravashi asked the following question. So I'm just going to remind you, by, which just means ask, but in the context of the Gemara, it's this kind of question. It's a two-sided question. Is it this or is it this? That's a baya. So by Ravashi, etzem kisora beklipata o below beklipata. As a bone that's the size of a barley corn. Is it with its skin or without its skin? Is it with its covering or without its covering? Bilacha o biyabasha o biyavesha. Is it talking about a moist one or a dry one? So Ravashi is also asking a question about shiurim. The first shiur, the shiur that he's interested in is etzim kisora. So what is he talking about? If anyone is familiar, etzim kisora. When do we say that the shear of a bone is the size of a saorah? For what purpose do we need to know the shear of a bone?
It's to see if to transfer tumas met.
Right. Very good. right? So if we have a bone from a dead person, in order for it to be metameh, it has to be the size of a seorah. So that's the way the tradition comes down. So Rav Ashi is asking about that tradition. What seorah were they measuring it against? Were they measuring it against uh, seorah that was in its skin or without its skin? Or was it measuring against a moist one or a dry one?
Is that a serious question, or is it a
It sounds like a not serious question, but it's a very
yes, no,
but it is a serious question. In other words, both of these questions, both Rav Papa's question and Rav Ashi's question, they're both serious questions. In both cases, we need to know, we're trying to determine the size. So both
it sounds like an ironic question, because the klipa is so much less than the Sorah itself, and you could ask a big Sorah or a small Sorah. This would do the difference, but the klipa, that doesn't make any difference.
Well, that's
the same for the date. You can have a big date, you can have a small date, but the stone in the date.
So actually, some of what you're raising, some of the questions you're raising, they're addressed elsewhere in the Mishnah, which I didn't. Maybe we'll look at. There's Mishnah in Kelim, and there's a Mishnah in the Gaim that talk about this. But for the moment, I just want to be able to read through the Gemara. So let's read through the Gemara. We'll take the Gemara at face value. We'll just take it the way it's presented, and the way it's presented, what's at stake is to try to determine what these shiurim are in reality. So let's bear in mind a couple of things that I'll just point out in general. So of course nowadays we're used to measuring things based on standardized measurements.
On grams, yeah.
So let's say, the most common is going to be in grams, and there are ways of there are internationally agreed ways of determining what a gram is, right? It's based in, and over time it's changed. I think when the metric system was first introduced, it was based on I don't remember now the whole story, right? But it was based on different things, and I think they were all related to water, which is considered to be a standard. And I think now it's changed altogether. I think that they're based on a more atomic view of materials and certain other things that are considered to be constants. However, in the ancient world, and I would say also until relatively recently, weights and standards, there were weights and standards, but ultimately they were based on everyday things. So Americans still use a foot as a measurement, which presumably, even though it's 12 inches, it's almost it's about 30 centimeters. Presumably, I think it was traced back to the idea it was measured by the foot of the king or something like that. Let's say for most of the world, measurements has more to do with commerce, right? It has more to do with business. If you're selling fruits and vegetables, you want to be able to say that you've weighed them, and whatever weight you're giving of, tomatoes is the correct weight. Or it's also used in business, let's say more essentially with gold and silver, where you need to have standards for gold and silver, and coinage is based on a certain amount of, let's say, gold or copper or silver that's in the coin. So those are all reasons to have standardized measurements.
Or in science or in baking.
So yes, so there are all these things that we use it for. And also, look, in the ancient world, they also used most of these same concepts were connected to measurement. But let's say in halakha, we have in addition to all of those, we have these. So let's say here on Yom Kippur, we have the question of at what point, if you eat on Yom Kippur, at what point will you be chayav? Gemara, as I'm sure you remember, in the beginning of the first sugya, determines, and we hold like Rabbi Yochanan, that even less than a shiur is asur min haTorah, but that doesn't tell me this question: how much would you have to eat in order to be, let's say, chayav b'chatat? So they're all pertinent questions. They're all pertinent questions, and as you also know, that shiurim that Chazal used many of them were related to things that grow, like an olive or an egg, or in our case, kekotevet hagasa. So you could say, okay, everybody knew what a kotevet hagasa is, but like Paul is saying, but maybe some are bigger, some are smaller. On the one hand, I think that's true, and on the other hand, they're not going to be vastly different. It's not like the difference between, an apple and a date. Nobody would say that those are the same measure. But dates in general, let's say, and everybody knew what a kotevet was, and a kotevet hagasa maybe also was a widespread phenomenon. Everybody knew. And the same thing when we come to barley corn. So barley corns, of course, are very small, but they're actually a very important measure in halakha. You can determine, let's say, the size of a mikveh based on the size of a seorah. There's a mathematical relationship between them. So all these things are actually very important. And I think there's more to say about it, but let's just take it now at face value. So when Rav Papa asks his question about the kotevet shamru, and there's a kotevet that's mentioned in the Mishnah, is it with its pit or is it without its pit? So our question is, what do you mean? It says kamoa kagarinata in the Mishnah. So let's look at Rashi. Rashi says begarinata o shelo begarinata. And then Rashi says right away, "V'hadiktani matnitin u kegarinata mibayile." So he says that which the Mishnah says u kegarinata. This is the question. Hechika amar. How do I read that? How do I read the word u kegarinata? Do I read it kamohu u kegarinata yachad? It's the size of the kotevet along with its pit together. Odilma hachikamar, or maybe I read it like this: kamoa o kigarinata. Do I read it like it, or like it, or like its pit? In other words, the vav achibur that we're used to in Mishnah doesn't always mean and. It sometimes means or. And so the question is, when it says kamoa ukagarinata, is it maybe it's making an equivalence between the flesh of the date with its pit? Maybe the nature of this kotevet is it had a lot of, it had however much flesh, however much fruit, and the pit actually was about the same size. If you remove the pit, it's like it could be a one-on-one, or it could be a little bit different. But the point is, when we read in the Mishnah, Kamoa ukagarinata, we could read it the way we read it, to begin with, which is it's the size of the pit with its size of the fruit with its pit, or maybe it means the size of the fruit or its pit. In other words, I can use either one as the measure. So that seems, yes, so it seems rachok, but this is how Rashi understands it. And we do have many instances in Mishnah where the vav can mean or, can mean in addition to or besides. So that's Rav Papa's question. He wants to, it's a genuine question. He really wants to understand, how do I read the Mishnah? Now, some of the later Mefarshim also explain that, well, you know what, I'll come back to that later. Let's just continue. So that's his question. Rav Ashi's question, again, which we're taking at face value, when we're talking about the size of the barley corn, are we talking about it with its klipa or without its klipa? And are we talking about one that is moist or one that is dry? So the Gemara here comments, it says, Rav Ashi lo mebayle had Rav Papa. Rav Ashi here doesn't ask the question of Rav Papa. In other words, he wasn't bothered by Rav Papa's question. Gasa itmar, kol kama de gasa, because the way he understands the term kikotevet hagasa, in other words, it could have just said kikotevet. Why does it say kikotevet hagasa? So it says gasa, meaning kol kama de gasa, as much as it can be fat, as much as it can be big. In other words, the implication is that kikotevet hagasa means the maximum size of whatever a kotevet would be. So that would imply the size of the kotevet along with its pit. That would be its maximum size. That's how he would understand. And that's why Rav Ashi doesn't ask the same question as Rav Papa. Rav Papa lo mebayle haid Rav Ashi. Rav Papa doesn't ask Rav Ashi's question. Lacha shibolet mikre, shelo b'klipata ushla mikre. Because Rav Papa also understood that the definition of terms here is self-evident, that if you're talking about a barley corn that's moist, it's not called a sa'ora, it's called shibolet. That was just the term that they used. So since the Mishnah talks about etzem, not our Mishnah, but Mishnah elsewhere, talks about etzem kisa'ora, so it must be talking about a dry barley corn, and a barley corn that doesn't have its skin, that would have been called ushla. So the fact that the Mishnah talks about etzem kisa'ora implies that it's both dry and it has its klipa. That's just by definition. And this is also how Rashi says, Usha karila, hilkach yivesha b'klipatahu demikre sa'ora. In other words, okay, so in other words, Rav Papa doesn't ask the question of Rav Ashi because he understands that the definition of those terms, the very definition of sa'ora implies that it's both with its klipa and that it's dry. Okay. Now you could also ask, why are the questions of Rav Papa and Rav Ashi brought side by side? So what do you think? Why do they bring both the questions? In other words, we need to know the answer to Rav Papa's question, right? Because that's our Mishnah. But what do we care about Rav Ashi's question? Why is that being brought at all?
he's also questioning the standard, the specific size of an object, the shear of the object.
Yes, in other words, it's a related question. In both cases, we're trying to define these shiurim. So we need to know what's going to be our standard. Okay, let's say. So at this point, we've answered. We say that Rav Papa, even though the Gemara says that we're speaking for Rav Papa, the Rav Papa doesn't ask Rav Ashi's question because he says that the answer is self-evident. The fact that the Mishnah talks about a Sa'orah means that it's dry and it's still with its klipa. But also, Paul, I would point out that even though the klipa doesn't seem to add much to the barley corn, but remember, the barley corn to begin with is a very small measure. So I would also argue that any amount is going to make a difference. And like I say, if you're measuring gold, that fraction is going to be substantial. Right? In other words, it'll have a real world implication, whether it has its klipa or not its klipa, and it's going to have a real now. But here, what kind of measurement? I should also be clear here. When we talk about kikoteven hagasa or the sa'orah, what are we measuring? What kind of measure is it? In other words, we have different categories of measurement. We have length and weight and volume. So what kind of measure are kokotevet hagasa and etzem kesora?
They're volume.
No?
I'm sorry, Michael, say again?
Their volume.
Right. These are volumetric measurements. So if you have one barley corn, it doesn't make that much difference. That's true. But if you have 10,000 of them, it's going to make a difference. And like I say, you can derive the size of a mikveh from the size of a sa'orah. So the measurement is relevant. The actual measurement that we're going to use and its particulars it's all going to be relevant. And so yes, here these are volumetric measurements. So presumably you can measure them in different ways, by displacement. Displacement would be a way of measuring the measurement, as opposed to measurements of weight, where you would have to use a scale of some sort. But here the concern is the volume. So, okay, so we're still left though. We haven't answered the question. We haven't entirely answered the question. Rav Papa asks this question, Kekotevet Hagasa, is it with or without its pit? And that's the main one that we're concerned about. The Gemara answers it in this sense, that Rav Ashi doesn't ask Rav Papa's question because he says Gasa itmar kol kama de Gasa. So if that's true, and Rav Ashi came after Rav Papa, then maybe we should say that the Kokotevet Hagasa is like the way we assume that Rav Ashi thought of it. And the same thing for Etzem Kisora. But the Gemara goes on and says, Amar Rabba, Amar Rav Yehuda, Kotevet Hagasa Shamru, Yitera Mikbeitza. The Kotevet Hagasa that they talked about is more than a kibetza. It's more than the size of an egg. Now, the Kimlahu the Rabbanan, it was established to the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan knew the Bahachi Miyat V'Date, Batzir mehachi lo miat v'datem. Why did they choose Kotevet Hagasa? Or how did they know that Kotevet Hagasa is the correct volume of food for which you'll be chayav eating on Yom Kippur? Because they had a tradition, they had like an established knowledge that if you eat that much, that's miyashev dat, it puts your mind at ease. So if you're really hungry and you eat this amount, that'll put your mind at ease. And so therefore that should be the amount that if you eat it on Yom Kippur, you'll be chayav. And less than that, lo miyat v'datem. Less than that, it's not going to put his mind at ease. So it tells you something about the way Chazal understood the Isur of eating on Yom Kippur. So it's interesting. Oh, actually reminds me, I was supposed to bring up something else. All right, if I remember, 1 second. Make a note. I wanted to bring up something else from a previous year. But here's the thing. The sheer halacha as a legal system needs to define boundaries. So so we can't just say you're not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. We have to say that you're not allowed to eat, such and such, a certain amount. But we need to define that. And we discussed this a little bit earlier in this year, that we have shirim for all kinds of things, including for eating, right? So that usually most isurei Torah, you're chayav for eating a kazayit. And there's also discussion about how much you have to eat in order to be chayav to say Birkat HaMazon. All of these things they're all relevant. Yom Kippur has a unique shiur, because here what we're concerned about is this idea of Yishuv Dat. So it tells you something about the way Chazal understood v'initem. It's not eating on Yom Kippur is an inui. So what makes it an inui? I could derive from this that the inui, the affliction, is that your mind is not at ease. It's an interesting, right? It's an interesting measure, because I might have just said, if you eat enough so that you're not hungry. And I would probably distinguish between being not hungry and being miyushav dat. On the one hand. On the other hand, both of those things, hunger and yishuv hadat, they're arguably relative to each of us. Some people, it doesn't bother them to not eat for a long time. And other people let's say the opposite, right? They feel the need to eat all the time, or else they don't feel at ease. So it's an interesting way of determining the shear. But that's why it says Kim Lahu Rabbanan, that the Rabbanan knew this. It was something that was it was like an established fact or an established phenomenon. So it means it's going to mean for most people, for an average person. So Rashi says, Kim Lahu Rabbanan ve'afal gav the kol shiur achilat isur b'kazayiti, even though other isurim in Torah, every other isur in the Torah, the established shear for eating is a kazayit. Hanimili hecha de ktiva achila. So that's where the Torah described the isur in terms of eating, achila. Avahacha asher lo te'une ktiv. Here it says anyone who is not afflicted. V'kol kama d'lo miyat v'date inuihu. All the time that the person doesn't have yishuv hadat, that their mind isn't at ease, that's an affliction. So what does Rashi mean? What's the difference between Isurei Achila elsewhere and the Isur of Achila on Yom Kippur?
This idea of Yeshuva dot doesn't apply to the other Yisrim of eating. It just really applies to Yom Kippur.
Yeah, in a word, yes. So it's based on the idea that the Torah itself, and we've now spent a lot of time on this. The Torah itself never says you're not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. It says you have to afflict yourself on Yom Kippur. So we understand that not eating is an affliction, but the threshold for that affliction is going to be different than the threshold for stam eating, for simply eating. So if you eat it, so kazayit is less than a kakotevet hagasa, even though we still haven't established exactly what that is. But if we just take an average date, we know that that's bigger than an average olive. So what I understand is that stam eating on Yom Kippur is not going to be the same. It's going to have to be a larger amount that will alleviate your affliction. You have to eat enough to alleviate your affliction so that you have yishuv hadat. And so therefore, it's not the same shiur. It's a completely unique shiur. It's only for Yom Kippur. Because Yom Kippur is, even though we talk about it in these terms that you're not allowed to eat, but the way the Torah talks about it is this idea that you need to afflict yourselves. One of the other things I'll say about that is, we're building up this idea of inui. And so we already saw that the Gemara understands that inui is a sheva al ta'aseh. It's something that you sit and you don't do. You don't have to actively afflict yourself. You don't have to beat yourself. You don't have to sit in the sun on a hot day or sit in the cold on a cold day, right? The Gemara talks about this, right? If it's very hot outside, you're allowed to go inside. If it's very cold outside, you're allowed to go inside. You're allowed to cover up. You're not supposed to actively flagellate yourself or make yourself suffer. So what's the inui? So the inui is the absence. One of the other terms that we've seen that's brought to bear in this discussion is ta'anug. That washing is a ta'anug, but because we view washing as a ta'anug, as something that's delightful, because of that, there are exceptions to it, because you can wash when it's not a ta'anug. You can wash to get dirt off yourself or to get excrement off yourself. You're allowed to do that. We ended off and then like Nilata Sandal, we ended off with the last sugya with this ma'amar of Shmuel. It's something I thought we might go into more, but for the moment, if you're putting a shoe on Yom Kippur because of the danger of a scorpion, that's mutar. It's permitted. It's not that it's patur. You're allowed to do that, right? And Rashi says, mutar kol adam lino. Anybody can put on a shoe. Rashi has to emphasize that because it comes right after the din of the chaya. The chaya is any woman who gave birth within 30 days is allowed to wear a shoe, but any person is allowed to wear a shoe to protect themselves from scorpion bites. So you could say, how could that be? The Torah says you're not allowed to wear shoes. Well, it's not that the Torah said you're not allowed to wear shoes. The Torah says you have to afflict yourself. So not wearing shoes in general is a kind of an affliction. But as we saw earlier in the sugya, there were different opinions about other things that you could put on your feet. So you didn't have, nobody says that you have to go, well, I shouldn't say that. We have one day on the Rishonim, we have the Balamor who held that actually you're not allowed to wear shoes of any sort on Yom Kippur. Although even the Balamor, I think, admits that you could wrap a cloth around your foot. But the idea again is that by not wearing shoes, you're keeping yourself from a kind of ta'anug. Ta'anug doesn't have to be some kind of an extreme pleasure. It could just mean that it's a comfort. You're comfortable when you wear shoes, and and the Torah wants you to be uncomfortable. But you don't have to go out of your way to make, to damage yourself or to risk any harm to yourself. And the same thing, like we said, with washing. Even though washing stam is a ta'anug, but if you're washing to get off excrement, that's mutar. And if you have some kind of a skin disease, you're allowed to put oil on, just the same way that you put on anyway, because you're not putting it on for a ta'anug. So Chazal seem to define this idea of inui as the absence of ta'anug. We take away ta'anug. So when we're talking about achila and shtiyah, this idea of yishuv hadat is the deciding factor. Meaning, if we understand ta'anug to mean a basic level of comfort, then eating a kotevet hagasa is enough to be miyashev dat. That's a basic level of comfort. Maybe it's just a psychological comfort, but that's a comfort, right? Those of us, we fast on Yom Kippur, and some people have a hard time fasting. Some people don't have a hard time fasting. I can tell you personally, I don't really have a hard time fasting. I don't feel hungry. I generally don't feel hungry on Yom Kippur. But as the day wears on, there's a kind of an anticipation that I want to eat. And that starts to gnaw at you. And of course, there's a kind of an irony, because at the end of Yom Kippur, when I can eat, I don't necessarily rush to eat, because once I know that I can eat, it becomes much less pressing. And I think it fits into this idea of yishuv hadat, that, you're so worried about eating, even if you know that your body is going to survive. It's not like you're going to fall over, faint or be in a coma, God forbid, for not eating for 25 hours. But it gets to you. And actually, I'll tell you also on a very personal level, when I was 12, I remember we went to shul. My mother gave me and my brother sandwiches. And she said, if you get hungry, you can eat. And I couldn't take it. And I think after Musaf, we had a youth service. And after Musaf, I had my sandwich. And of course, it was a long time ago. It was over 50 years ago, but I still remember it because I was a little embarrassed at myself for having broken down and eaten. But I think it had entirely to do with this idea of yishuv hadat. There was like a real psychological block against continuing to fast. Anyway, yeah, one of the people who follows the shir on the video asked about this, that in general about the inuyim, like if you remember earlier, we talked about this idea of going barefoot as an inui, and the Gemara was trying to bring different proof texts to prove it. And one of the proof texts talks about how when David was running away from Avshalom, he was yachef. And then, and then that's related to another pasuk that talks about it as an inui. And then the Gemara is doche. The Gemara says no, and when it talks about David being yachef, it just meant that he didn't have his horse. That for a king not to have a horse, that's like being barefoot. So what was that about? So even though, of course, that's ultimately not where we're going to bring the proof from, but there is this idea, again, that to be mitaneh, to afflict yourself in a biblical sense, doesn't mean that you have to physically harm yourself or attack yourself. But if you are removed from something that is a baseline comfort for yourself, then that's already considered an inui. And they pointed out that this, I had a little discussion with them on email, and they pointed out that this seems to be unlike the way Christians view inui, or at least in some Christian practice, that they did flagellate themselves. They would do things. Now, I have to interject and say there were also streams in Judaism that would do that. Not necessarily in Yom Kippur, but there were different customs that came about to do tshuva, and there is an idea of being naked in the snow or flagellating yourself or things like that. But those, as we know, those things were not so widespread, and they didn't stay with us. In Jewish thought, it's not that you have to go out of your way to make yourself miserable, but you do it in this kind of passive way. In any event, let's go on in the Gemara. The Gemara, at this point, so the Gemara says, Rabbah says that the Kotevet Hagasa is more than a Kibetza. He makes this claim that it must be more than a Kibetza. And now the Gemara brings a Braita to disprove that, or it's actually a Mishnah. Meitive Maaseh Heviu Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai lidom et tavshil, uRabban Gamliel shtei kotavot udli shamayim, v'amru ha'elum l'sukkah. Okay, so you might remember this Mishnah from Sukkah. It was a story that they brought Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai to taste of some cooked food, and Rabban Gamliel, they brought him 2 kotavot. Here's our kotevet. They brought him 2 actual kotavot and a container of water, and they said, bring them up to the sukkah. So who said bring them up to the sukkah?
Both of us is Vamru.
Both of whom, so there's Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabban Gamliel.
Yes.
Okay, so what? So when we read the Mishnah, what is our thought? Why would they say to bring them to the sukkah?
It's considered they consider it as if they're eating a meal, so it needs to be in the sukkah.
Okay, so in other words, the assumption is our basic assumption would be, oh, I see that when you're eating this much food, let's say, when you're eating this much food, you have to eat it in the sukkah. That would be my assumption. V'taniela. So there's a braita that's a nispach to this. It's an addendum to this Mishnah, and it says, "Lo bimnei shehalacha kach." They didn't say to bring the food into the sukkah because that's halacha, that they would have to eat it in the sukkah. Ella shratzu lahachmir al atzman. Rather, they said to bring it in the sukkah because they wanted to be machmir on themselves. Ukishnatnu lo l'Rabbi Yitzadok ochel pachot michbeitza nitalo b'mapa v'achalo chutz l'sukkah v'lo birech acharav. When they gave Rabbi Tzadok food that was less than the size of a beitzah, he took it with a mapa. In other words, he took a cloth. He didn't touch it directly. He wrapped it in a cloth, and he ate it outside of the sukkah. And he also didn't say a bracha afterwards. He didn't say a bracha achrona on what he ate. So what does that imply? Rabbi Tzadok, so when they gave Rabbi Tzadok to eat, they gave him, and he was given less than a kibetza. He ate it outside of the sukkah. So what is that? What would that imply about eating, about his eating vis-a-vis the sukkah, or eating generally vis-a-vis the sukkah?
If the food was less than a beitzah, then it's not considered a meal. He didn't feel the need to eat in the sukkah or wash or say a bracha afterward.
Yeah, so it says all these things, right? That eating less than a kibetza, there's no chiyuv to eat that in a sukkah. And less than a kibetza, you don't have to make a bracha achrona. And Nitalo b'mapa may be also, Nitalo b'mapa is a trickier thing, because if it's something, let's say if it was bread, so what does that imply? That you don't have to wash, but you don't have to wash only if you're holding it through an intermediary. We'll come back to that. Okay. So the Gemara says on this, ha-kebetza by sukkah. If it would have been a kebetza, this implies, like you just said, if they brought him a kebetza to eat, it would need a sukkah. You would need to eat it in the sukkah. Okay. So remember, Gemara is going to ask is going to articulate its kasha, but let's just remember what the kasha is going to be on. Our kasha is going to be on this declaration of Rabbah that he wants to say Kotevet Hagasa is more than a kibetza. So we have here a little logic problem. We have here a little logic thing. So what's the logic? Rabban Gamliel, what did Rabban Gamliel eat?
Two dates, two kodvot.
He had two kotovot. And what did Rabbi Tzadok eat?
Less than a beitzah.
Less than a kibetza. So the Gemara says, right? Ha kibetza b'maisu. V'isal kadatach kotevet hagasa she'amru yitei rabbi kibetza. If you would think that the kotevet hagasa that they said, that they talked about in our Mishnah, is more than a kibetza, hashta shtei kotavot below garin lo havu kibetza. Here, two kotavot without their pit does not equal a kibetza. Kotevet hagasa garinata mi havi yitera mi kibetza. So how could it be that a kotevet hagasa, even with its pit, would be more than a kibetza? Okay, so what does the Gemara mean? So we find out about Rabban Gamliel. He ate two kotavot. Now, when he ate the kotavot, did they have a pit or they didn't have a pit? This really isn't a trick question. When
Uh,
you eat a date, do you eat the pit or not?
no.
No. So Rabban Gamliel, who ate 2 dates, what did he eat? He ate 2 dates without their pits. Right? That's reasonable. In other words, remember, Kikotevet Hagasa is the shiur. And like we said, that's a volumetric shiur. If you eat an actual date, if the shiur means the shiur of the fruit along with its pit, so if you eat a date, if you eat a kokotevet without its pit, then you haven't eaten the shiur. Again, if somebody gives you a kokotevet hagasa with its pit, and let's say everybody agrees this is the shiur, let's say that's the shiur, that it means with its pit. That's the shiur. So if you remove the pit and you eat the date, are you chayav on Yom Kippur? Are you chayav a chatat or not?
No, you're patur.
You're patur. Why?
Because you haven't reached the shore because it's without the pit, and the shore includes the pit.
Okay. Just to keep that in mind, right? Bear that in mind. So Rabban Gamliel ate 2 kotavot without their pits, right? Because we know that he didn't eat their pits. Nobody thinks that he ate the pits. So he ate 2 kotavot without their pits. He wanted to eat them in the sukkah. But what did the Gemara say? He didn't have to eat them in the sukkah. Right? He only did it to be machmir on himself. So 2 kotavot without their pits was not a shiur that would have required him to eat in the sukkah. And what did Rabbi Tzadok eat? He ate less than a kibetza. And he lechatchila ate outside of the sukkah. So, Yisal Kadata, Kotevet Hagasa, Shamru, Yitera Mikabetza, if you would have thought that Kotevet Hagasa that Chazal talked about is more than a kabetza, how could that be? 2 whole kotavot without their pits don't even equal a kabetza. How do I know that?
From Rabban Gamliel.
So what's the logic? How do I know? How do I know that those 2 kotavot didn't equal a kabetza?
Because if they did it kabetza, then he would have eaten it. He would have had to eat it in the sukkah.
Oh, so that's the implication. In other words, I learned from Rabbi Tzadok that if you're eating less than a kabetza on sukkahs, you don't have to eat in the sukkah. Rabban Gamliel wanted to be machmir on himself, so he ate, even though he didn't have to, he ate in the sukkah. But what's the implication? Why didn't he have to eat it in the sukkah? Because the 2 kotavot together didn't equal even 1 kibetza. So, if you would think, Yisal Kadata, Kotevet Hagasa, Shamru, Yiterami Kibetza, how could it be that 1 Kotevet Hagasa is more than a kibetza when 2 kotavot, albeit without their garin, doesn't equal a kibetza? Because if it did equal a kibetza, then Rabban Gamliel would have had to eat it in the sukkah min adin. So, what's the kasha? Kasha is, Rabbah says that Kotevet Hagasa is more than a kibetza. But here, if I understand this story the way we've laid it out, it can't possibly be that a Kotevet Hagasa is more than a kibetza. Because 2 kotavot, albeit without their garinim, but 2 kotavot don't equal a kibetza. So how could it be? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah in shtei kotovot below garinatan lo havi kabetza. So he says, yes, it's true. 2 kotovot without their pit does not equal a kabetza. It's less than a kabetza. But kotevet hagasa ugarinata havi yiterami kabetza. But 1 kotevet with its garin is more than a kabetza. That's the way he answers. So he says he's going to take the information that we have, that we understand that what Rabban Gamliel ate was kotovot without their pit. He says, okay, without their pit, they're much smaller. But if I have even 1 with its pit, that was more than a kabetza. Amar Rav Papa, Haini Damrin, she tre kabi de tamri, chad kabi de kshicha b'suriach. Rava Amar Hatam Hainu Taima Mishum Dahavule Piri Lobai Sukkah. So what is Rav Papa say? He says it's like people say 2 kav, 2 measures of dates. If you have 2 measures of dates, like a kav, right, it's a certain measure. Let's say it's 2 pounds, it's more than that. But so you have 2 pounds of dates. So 1 kav, in other words, half of the whole, chad kav de kshita usriach. Half of it is just going to be the stuff that you don't eat. Half of it is going to be kshita is the pit. It's like from the word kasha, the hard part, and the sariach is like, I think it's like the extra stuff. So it's like the extra stuff that's inside between the pit and the flesh. So what is Rav Papa saying? That half the volume of a given date is not fruit. So if you have 2 actual dates and you remove their pits, it's the same as if you had 1 kotevet hagasa. And he says that's what people say, Damri and Sheet. This is like widespread knowledge. Everybody knows that half of the size of the date is going to be the pit and the extra stuff. So he's supporting the answer of Rabbi Yirmiyah, and Rabbi Yirmiyah's answer is that yes, it's true that 2 kotovot without their garin doesn't equal a kabetza, but 1 kotevet hagasa with its garin is even more than a kabetza. Now, there's also a little bit of a logic problem here, but let's go with it. But ultimately, Rava says, no, he gives a completely different answer. He says, Hatam hainu tama mishum dahavele pire lo ba'usuka. Says, no, there, the reason is that they were eating fruit, and fruit doesn't need a sukkah. So where is there? What is he saying?
Talking about Rabban Gamliel again.
Going back to Rabban Gamliel, and what is he saying? Hainu Tama, the reason for what was?
The reason that he didn't need to eat the sukkah is because he was just eating fruit. He wasn't eating something more substantial.
Right. In other words, once I say that Rabban Gamliel was machmir on himself to eat his kotovot in the sukkah just because they were peirot, and that's why he didn't have to eat them in the sukkah. So then, how does that answer the question that we asked to begin with, which was, what was our question to begin with?
Is it a date with the pit or without the pit?
That was a question which we didn't entirely answer, But the immediate question that we had was this: that Rabbah, it says in the name of Rav Yehuda that the Kotevet Hakasa that they said is more than a kibetza. And then I wanted to disprove it from what I learned from Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Tzadok, to say it can't be that a kotevet is more than a kibetza. If two kotevot don't equal a kibetza, how could one kotevet equal a kibetza or be more than a kibetza? And so the Gemara answers, and the Gemara says, Rabbi Yirmiyah says, two kotevot without their garin, it's true, it doesn't equal a kibetza. But one kotevet with its garin is actually more than a kibetza. So Rava says, no, I don't need any of that. I don't need any of that logic, because you're basing your whole proof on the idea of Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Tzadok. And Rabban Gamliel didn't eat in the sukkah not because, Rabban Gamliel ate in the sukkah mishum chumrah. He ate in the sukkah mishum chumrah. And what was the chumrah? Not because he was eating less than a shear. He ate in the sukkah because he was eating fruit. And even if he was eating a lot of fruit, he didn't have to eat in the sukkah. So you don't learn anything about the shear of what you need to, about the shear from that story. You wanted to say, look, Rabban Gamliel ate two kotavot, and he didn't have to eat them. And your assumption was, why didn't he have to eat them in the sukkah? Because they were together less than a kibetza. But I'm going to tell you, it's faulty logic. I don't know what they are in relationship to a kibetza from the story. I only know that he didn't have to eat them because in the sukkah because they were fruit. Let's look at Rashi. So actually, in this little part of the sugya, we've brought up actually a lot of different things, which I think next time we're going to go into in a little bit more depth. I didn't want to get into the whole thing at Simchas Torah more than we had to, but now we've brought up a few issues about, we're still concerned about our shiur. Is the shiur of the Mishnah, Kotevet Agasa, is that with the bit or not with the bit? The way the Gemara ended up before we get to the Kasha, before we get to Rabbah and the Kasha and Rabbah, it sounds like the Gemara is leaning toward the idea that Ravashi, right? Ravashi doesn't ask the question of Rav Papa about whether the Kotevet has the garin or doesn't have the garin, because he understands Kotevet Agasa means Kol Kama de Gasa, as big as it gets. So it would mean that it has the garin. That would be the volume. It would be the volume of the tamar, of the Kotevet, with the garin. But when we come to Rabbah says Kotevet Hakasa Shamru, it's more than a kibetza. He's still trying to define the Kotevet Hakasa in relation to other shiurim. He doesn't directly address the question of whether it has the garin or not. We'll flesh that out a little bit more. Anyway, so this is the kasha and the teretz that the Gemara gives. The kasha is Rabbah says Kotevet Hagasa is more than a kibetza, and from the Maaseh of Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai and Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Tzadok, I want to say that that's a proof that the Kotevet Hagasa has to be less than a Kibetza. It can't be more than a Kibetza. And so Rabbi Yirmiyah says, okay, I'm going to differentiate because once I remove the Garin, it's much less. It's at least half the size without the Garin. And so 2 Kotovot could be less than a Kibetza. But 1 Kotevet with its Garin could be more than a Kibetza. And then Rava says, the whole kasha doesn't, I can push away the whole kasha by telling you that I don't learn anything about the relative size of shiurim here. Because the only reason that they didn't eat that they wanted to eat in the sukkah, Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, was they were being machmir on themselves. And yesh k'tzat ra'aya, because what did they bring to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? Litomet the tafshil, just to taste the tafshil. So if they just brought it in for him to taste, presumably that's a very small amount. It would be less than any shear that we were talking about. And nonetheless, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was machmir on himself to eat in the sukkah. And it says, they said, both of them, both Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Gamliel said, to bring all the food into the sukkah. So yesh k'tzat raya to Rava that the whole point of them eating in the sukkah was just to be machmir that they wanted to eat in the sukkah. It had nothing to do with the amount of food they were eating. Now, what about Rabbi Tzadok? Rabbi Tzadok, they gave him less than a kibetza, and nonetheless, they gave him less than a kibetza, and he wrapped it, and he took it in a mapa, and ate it, michutz sukkah. So, Rashi says, Shosha kulin nahagbo. He was making on 3 things. Achat shelo natal yadav. Right? Instead, he wrapped it in a mapa. Mapa karach yadav, mishum aninuta dat. And the reason he wrapped it was aninuta dat, like he was a very fine person. He wanted to eat it in a refined kind of way. B'chutz sukkah achalo, he ate it outside of the sukkah, and he didn't bench afterwards. So he was nohek 3 kulot. Ha-kibetza by sukkah, right? So the diuk from Rabbi Tzadok is, because they gave him ochel that was less than a kibetza, he ate it outside of the sukkah. But if he was eating a kibetza, he would need to eat it in the sukkah. Rashi says, Alma shtei kotovot amran la'el lo shehalacha ken pchutot hen mikabetza. Right? Wait a second. The 2 kotovot the Rabbi Gamliel ate earlier, that he ate outside of the sukkah, not because halacha was that you have to eat, that he ate in the sukkah, not because he had to eat in the sukkah, but because he wanted to. But now I understand, we did the cheshbon, it implies that the 2 of them together must have been less than a kibetza. How do I know? Hashta shtei kotavot below garin lo havi kibetza, kotavet agasa garinata mi havi yetera mikibetza. 2 kotavot without the pit, shachalan Rabban Gamliel b'sukkah. The 2 kotavot that Rabban Gamliel ate in the sukkah, v'amru alayu lo shahalacha kain. And they said about them, about eating them in the sukkah, not he ate them in the sukkah, despite the fact that halacha was that he didn't have to. So, Rabbi Yirmiyah answers, says, "In shtei kotovot below garinatan lo havi kabetza." The two kotovot together don't equal one kabetza, but one kotevet agasa and its garin is more than a kabetza, and it's like people say that if you have two measures of dates, then half the measure is going to be the fruit, and half the measure is going to be the pit and the extra. The Sariach, and Rashi says, Yesh behen kav garinin v'yoter. There's actually going to be more than a kav, a little bit more than half is going to be the garin and the extra. Alma hagarin yoter min hakotevet, usriach lashon odef. Sariach is a language of extra. When it talks about the coverings to the Mishkan, right? So it talks about how some of it hangs over on the back of the Mishkan. So that's the excess. It's the extra that hangs over. So okay, so this is what we get. Rabbi Yirmiyah wanted to say that the reason that, wait a second, I think I better go back and start from the beginning. Okay, but let's go back and just recap this whole thing. And then I think we're going to stop. Next time, I want to go into some of the details a little bit more. But let's recap. We start off with this question of Rav Papa about Kotevet Hagasa. Does that mean with its garim or not with its garim? And there's a kind of a hint to an answer that it would mean with its garim, because the Gemara says Rav Ashi doesn't ask this question because he understands that gasa implies as big as it can get. So it would mean kekotevet gasa would mean the fruit and the garin together. Then we have Rabbah who says in the name of Rav Yehuda that kotevet hagasa is more than a kibetza. And why is it that shiur? Because that's the shiur of Yishuv Dat. We talked a little bit about that. Then the Gemara challenges Rabbah from this maaseh of these Tanaim on Sukkot. And what we see is that Rabban Gamliel ate 2 kotovot. The Gemara explains he could have eaten them outside of the sukkah, because he could have eaten them outside of the sukkah. The havamina is, at that point, because they're less than a shiur that one would need to eat in the sukkah. And Rabbi Tzadok, who explicitly was given less than the kibetza, l'chatchila ate outside of the sukkah. So what does that tell me? From Rabbi Tzadok, I understand that if he had been given a kibetza, he would have had to eat in the sukkah. So the kibetza seems to be the shear at which one has to eat in the sukkah. Rabban Gamliel didn't have to eat in the sukkah, even though he ate 2 kotavot. So what does it imply? That the 2 kotavot together don't equal 1 kibetza. So far, so good. So if that's true, how could it be that 1 kotevet hagasa is more than a kibetza? So the assumption of the question is that so we know that Rabban Gamliel was eating kotavot without the garin because nobody eats the garin. But the assumption is going to be that so if I would eat 1 kotevet with the garin, that couldn't be more than the 2 kotavot without the garin. But actually, the Gemara ends up implying that it is. That actually the kotevet hagasa is going to be more than a kibetza. Why is that? Rabbi Yirmiyah says, yes, it's true. 2 kotavot without their pit is less than a kibetza, but 1 kotevet hagasa with its garin actually is more. And hainu damri imshi, if you have 2 kav of tamarim and 1 kav of, if you have 2 kav of tamarim, then you have 1 kav of that, half of it is going to be just the garin and the sariyah. So what would that tell you? If you have 1 kotevet, half of the volume is the garin. That's the implication. Half the volume is the garin. So how could it, so here, let's do the math. 2 kotavot without the garin should equal 1 kotevet. But we said 2 kotavot without the garin is less than a kibetza. So 1 kotevet should be also less than a kibetza. So it doesn't seem to add up for Rabbi Yirmiyah, because Rabbi Yirmiyah wants to say, right? He says kotevet hagasa v'garinata is more than a kibetza. So how does he come to that conclusion? You see what I'm asking? This is what I meant before, that we have to talk about the math. So the math doesn't seem to add up, but Rashi seems to address this when this is how he understands the sariyah. So he says, Shtei kotavot below garin, that Rabban Gamliel ate in the sukkah, and they said about it, lo shahalacha kain, he didn't have to eat it in the sukkah. All right, that's less than a kibetza, but 1 kotevet hagasa with its garin is more than a kibetza, and it's like people say, Trei kavi de tamri, 2 kav of tmarim, big garin hon, right? 2 whole kav of tmarim with their pits, havu kav de kashita. So 1 kav of that is going to be just the pit, this sariyah, and the sariyah on top of it. In other words, there's a little bit more that's going to go with the side of the pit. Yeshman kav garinin v'yoter. And so when you have the whole date with the pit, it actually is more than the 2 dates without their pits. Alma hagarin yoter mina kotevet. So it tells you that the garin is actually more than the kotevet. In other words, the garin with the excess, with the extra stuff, is more than the kotevet. And he explains that sariyach is lashon odef. So that's how the math works. That's how Rashi says the math works. But in any event, we push aside this whole idea, because Rava says, no, actually, the whole reason that Rabban Gamliel didn't have to eat in the sukkah is just because he was eating fruit. So it leaves us a question about, actually that's how we paskin, even though hayashum havamina, that what was koveya for when you eat in the sukkah was how much you're eating and not necessarily what you were eating. But nowadays we say, right, halacha is like the way Rava implies, that if you eat fruit outside of the sukkah, that's okay, and you don't have to keep track of how much you're eating. We have maybe a couple of questions about Rabbi Tzadok and why he chose to not wash. The implication is that he was eating something for which he should have washed. So for average people like us, that means bread. but there could be other reasons, and we'll talk about it next time. The idea, though, is that Rabbi Tzadok was a Kohen, and he was noheg to eat his food, the taharat truma, I believe is the diuk. So it's a little bit of a side issue for us, but it's an interesting point, and I'll go into it a little bit next time. I think that's it for today, though. And yeah, any last questions, comments? No.
No.
Okay.
It's enough for
Okay.
today.
Right.
All right.
I'm not gonna give you a test, so it's okay.
All
All right.
right. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye
Bye.
bye.